effective approaches for community media in communicating climate change. Climate change is the story of our time. The media are an important part in informing the public about climate change, as well as helping communities find solutions. But journalists need training to help connect their bits to climate change. The purpose of this training program is to help community journalists learn how to connect climate change stories to any beat. Traditionally, climate change stories tend to be assigned to the science or environment beat. That's a mistake. Climate change affects all beats. And after this training, you will learn how to tell compelling climate change stories regardless of your beat. Now, to be an effective storyteller, start by understanding climate science. You don't have to be a scientist to understand the fundamentals of climate change. According to renowned climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe, the term climate change refers to the broad range of changes happening to the planet as a result of global warming, including rising sea levels, melting glaciers, increases in the frequency and or intensity of extreme weather events like heat waves and heavy precipitation events, and shifts in flower and plant blooming times. Now, the primary cause of climate change today is human activity, especially the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. These activities release large amounts of greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, into the atmosphere, which trap heat and cause the planet to warm. To help you develop that core climate change literacy, like a good journalist who pursues fact-based reporting, we have identified these resources for you. There is Climate Science 101, which you can access through this link. You can also access data to use to show that the planet is warming over time in the next link. There's also the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication, which is a really good resource. And then there is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an international panel, and they have good reports. Now, the mission of the Boyd National Center for Community Media at Kansas State University is to serve and strengthen community media because they play a key role in the survival and revitalization of America's small towns and rural communities. We do that through research and training. In developing this training program about the best practices to use in communicating climate change, we wanted this curriculum to be informed by deep research. We went as far back as possible, in fact, over a 50-year period, to understand how the media has framed climate change over the years. Now, when we talk about media framing, framing refers to the process of selecting the language to use to communicate about an issue, as well as the impact that such choices have on how audiences in turn perceive such an issue and form opinions about it. We found that frames that the media has used in climate stories over time include scientific consensus, economic consequences, environmental consequences of climate change, the ethics or moral framing. For example, framing that says this generation has a moral or ethical obligation to take care of the earth or the planet. They've also framed it as a disaster, and at times they have used the public health frame. Other times they have talked about climate change is a national security issue. For example, when climate change affects agriculture in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, we have seen droves of immigrants moving to Europe or the United States because of food insecurity, and that is a national security issue. And we have put all those frames that have been used over the last 50 years in a table that you can access here. Now, what are the reasons for the various frames that have been used by the media over the last 50 years or so? Many of these frames emerged because of major research findings, or because of international conferences, or the politics of the time. But in the same way that the media was an active participant in amplifying the various frames of a time, the media is key in reframing the narrative around climate change. That is where community media comes in. Community journalists actively advocate on issues for common good and are ideally suited to drive the conversation around climate change and possible solutions in their communities. Instead of focusing on individual frames like the media has done in the past, we will show you a new and innovative way of communicating climate change. Come along. Good journalism must not restrict climate coverage to the science and weather beats. Instead, journalists must learn how to connect climate change to all the other bits such as agriculture, politics, business, health, housing, education, food, national security, entertainment, sports, etc. And good climate change journalism must not restrict itself to a single frame. Another lesson, the issue of language and focus. Avoid using scientific terminologies in your stories. Learn to interpret the science in a language that is accessible to your audience. And talking about language, due to misinformation and partisan politics, community journalists need to use language that is less divisive and more unifying. Instead of using the term climate change, focus on relatable events and impacts. For example, extreme weather events such as sudden and intense heat waves, rain bombs like the one that happened recently in central Texas, where a river swelled for more than 20 feet in 30 minutes, or sweltering summer night temperatures that impact corn pollination, are all relatable, and those stories can be told using less triggering language. Let me show you an example. It's from agriculture. Let's talk about agriculture and make it personal and local. In 2022, in Haskell County in Kansas, heat rocketed from 80 degrees to 101 in just 2 days. Sudden heat wave killed 2,000 cattle. Each was valued at $2,000. The economic loss and trauma to the farming community was real. And suddenly, what may have felt like a distant or overwhelming topic of climate change becomes personal and local. Unfortunately, That incident is unlikely to be a one-off event. And here is why. Research indicates that such extreme heat that causes loss to farmers is projected to increase by 58% by 2030. You can read that here in this link. Researchers at Kansas State University recently conducted research that looked at the impact of climate change on farm productivity and profitability. They found that over the last 4 decades, wherever there is a 1 degree centigrade of warming, farm income decreased by 70%. What does that mean? It means that for a typical farm, this translates to about $43,000. Now, crop insurance helps farmers cover half the losses, not all, half. That means farmers are likely to rely more and more on financial and technical assistance because of climate change. That is a story that affects the farmers who consume the journalism that you produce in your community. That is not a story about politics. It is a story about survival. And it is real, it is raw, and it is local. In the next module, I will show you some possible stories focusing on solutions to the climate change issues covered in the various bits. Covering Climate Now, an initiative that collaborates with journalists and newsrooms to produce more informed climate change stories, has some helpful suggestions on how to link climate change to the various bits. For reporters covering food and agriculture bit, they suggest focusing on the following issues. How are farming and production practices changing to cope with climate impacts on farmlands or to reduce emissions? What new foods are entering our diets to help mitigate climate change? How are industrial practices contributing to climate change? How are farmers, interest groups, helping lead farmers to sustainable farming practices or opposing changes? If you are a reporter covering the politics and government beat, here are some suggestions. I recommend making the following connections. How are governments enabling or inhibiting a transition to greener sources of energy? Are government leaders responsible for disinformation in the climate space? How are governments supporting the transition of workers employed in the fossil fuel industries? If you are covering the health beat, here are some possible stories. How are stronger and more frequent extreme weather events affecting the well-being of farmers? How are the health consequences of climate change experienced unequally as a matter of race, class, or gender? How are hospitals and healthcare systems responding to the extra burdens of climate-related conditions, such as rampant heat exhaustion? How has habitat destruction and loss of biodiversity set the conditions for the spread of new viruses? We don't just amplify issues and problems. Good community journalism helps their communities find solutions. So here are some suggestions in terms of how you can do that. Because with headlines full of disasters and tragedies, it is easy to feel helpless. But the truth is, every person has the power to be a part of the solution. Try and tell stories that are relatable and engaging and can move your community to possible solutions. You can connect those stories to real life experiences of members of your community. I have an example. When climate impact follows you on your vacation, that's relatable. For example, when the Eiffel Tower is closed due to extreme heat that ruins your Paris vacation, or how rising sea levels have eroded your favorite Caribbean beach. That's personal and it's relatable. We've talked about some of the challenges facing agriculture, facing farmers. So what are some possible solutions? How can the community help the struggling local farmer? As a community journalist, you should produce a story about supporting local farmers by buying local produce. Or you can encourage locals to plant trees and walk them through the process in a compelling story that empowers them to be part of the solution. Talking about trees might actually end up saving the planet. You know why? We have always known that in the process of photosynthesis, trees pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. For that reason, planting trees is a great solution to climate change. But I have breaking news for you. Scientists recently discovered a fig tree that is grown in Kenya has the ability to pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turn it into stone and permanently sequester the greenhouse gas for thousands of years. That's a game changer. Because unlike other trees that temporarily store carbon in leaves and wood, this particular species turns carbon dioxide into sodium carbonate. That is the durable mineral found in limestone. And there is more good news. Those scientists believe that there are many such trees around the world waiting to be discovered. You can read more about that research in this link. This is new research and it's a gold mine for many solution-oriented stories for your community. You can start by writing a story that informs your community about the new discovery and its potential in addressing some of the local challenges. You could also do a second story whereby you go to local research institutions to see if the discovery has inspired them to start searching for such species locally. Another solution-oriented story is to encourage your community to adopt sustainable transportation. Transportation is a great contributor to climate change through burning fossil fuels in vehicles, trains, and airplanes. But alternative transport systems have emerged in recent years. Think about the ride-hailing services such as Uber that have emerged lately. But news about such services rarely make a connection about their contribution in reducing greenhouse gases. Several cities have purchased bikes that are free for citizens to use to get around. We tend to frame those stories as if the service is for poor people who have no transportation. That's a mistake. You can also take a look at e-mobility or electric vehicles and frame them as solutions. I'll give you a couple more solutions. You can encourage your audiences to reduce plastic use. Explain why and how. Empower them with information and a call to action. I got news for you. Indigenous communities have centuries of accumulated wisdom for mitigating climate change. But guess what? That wisdom has largely been ignored. Make it your job to find it and amplify it in your community. In conclusion, climate change can feel overwhelming, abstract, and distant. Here is the trick. Events caused by climate change impact people. So find the human connection to the story. Then find a local connection. Because when it is local, it is easier to motivate your audience to take action and find solutions. Thank you for listening.